Welcome to another episode of Tanach Study and Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and you are watching Archaeology Snapshot on Sefer Zephania, book number 9 of Trei Assar of the 12 Small Prophets. And this particular episode is the end of an era, and I'm going to explain what I'm talking about as we go through. As always, our stated aim, goal, and mission is to answer when is the story happening, who are the main players, where are the main locations, with some highlights from history and archaeology. So let's get straight into Sefer Zephania and start with when exactly is the story happening. Sefer Zephania, the final warning of the doom of Malchut Yehuda, the destruction of Malchut Yehuda, Malchut Israel, the kingdom of Israel, has already been destroyed by the mighty and terrifying Assyrian Empire. And the kingdom of Israel is now in a period of time in which we have a little bit of air to breathe before the coming destruction. What do I mean a little bit of air to breathe? Sefer Zephania actually opens up with the pedigree, the family line of the Navi, which is very, very rare in Tanach, especially when it goes several generations back. We usually have one generation back, but this begins with Zephania ben Kushi ben Gedaliah ben Amariah ben Chizkiah. So we have the name of the person who is presumably a descendant of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. It could be a different Chizkiah, we don't know, but the Mefarshim assume that this is very likely, and it also places him in the right period of time. Bimei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda. This is happening during the days of Yoshiyahu ben Amon. Now Amon is the son of Menashe. Menashe was a wicked king, an evil king who ended up doing teshuvah towards the end, and he corresponded to Ashur-banipal, the last mighty king of Assyria, who towards the end of his 28-year powerful reign started declining, and Assyria was on the downfall, and basically is going to be destroyed very soon by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes and so on. Now, the period of Yoshiyahu is very, very important to us because, as we mentioned in several of the episodes, which pretty much parallel this period of time, is Yoshiyahu was a good king, a king who was able to counteract the decrees against Torah by Menashe and by his evil father Amon, who only ruled for 2 years. And he found this hidden Sefer Torah in the Heichal, and the Sefer Torah was opened up to Sefer Devarim, to the Tochechot, to the rebukes, to what will happen if we do not keep the Torah and the mitzvot and the Brit and the covenant. And he instituted a reform, which historians called Yoshiyahu's reforms, and there's a lot of, and it is a milestone in the final days of Malchut Yehuda. Why a milestone? Because Yoshiyahu HaMelech instituted the biggest kiruv, you can say, the biggest teshuvah movement in our history. And he was convinced that he was righteous and that everyone was on his side, and that therefore he was able to have the moral high ground to block Paro Necho from coming through, just passing through Eretz Yisrael on his way to join the Assyrian Empire, their former mortal enemy, against a greater enemy, which is Malchut Bavel. So we are in this period of time, which Professor Oded Lifshitz of the Tel Aviv University calls a power vacuum. In other words, Eretz Yehuda, or Israel, is sandwiched between two mighty world powers. You have Egypt on the south, and you have Assyria on the north, and they are declining. So we have the ability to rebuild the economy, not to pay taxes, and to institute this reform, which Yoshiyahu instituted, as our historians call it, or which we will just say is teshuvah, is adhering to the mitzvot. So if Zephania is now coming and giving a warning, which is really 3 major prophecies about the coming destruction of Bavel and the utter destruction of the kingdom and the region, including other nations, then it must be that this is before Yoshiyahu was successful in instituting all of these reforms or this teshuvah movement, and rather it was in his earlier days. And this sort of parallels later nevuot of Yirmiyahu and of Huldah Nevi'ah, perhaps some of the things that Yechezkel talks about, because Yechezkel is speaking 11 years before the destruction in the time of Tzidkiyahu, right? So we have other Nevi'im who also talk about the destruction which is going to come by Bavel, the Kasdim. We mentioned this also earlier. So it's not unique to Zephania, but there are certain things about Zephania which are unique. And that is going to be our next point, which is the Yom Hashem, the Day of the Lord, which is a repetitive theme throughout Sefer Zephania. What is Yom Hashem? What is the day of the Lord? V'haya b'yom zevach Hashem, in the day of the korban of Hashem, ufakadati al asarim ve'al bnei hamelech. V'haya b'yom hahu, on that day, v'haya ba'et hahi, and it goes on and on. Has mipnei Hashem Elokim, ki karov Yom Hashem, ki hechin Hashem zevach hikdish kiru'av. Fear and shudder and be scared, because the day of Hashem is going to be coming. The day of the Lord is coming, in which Hashem is going to bring an offering, a zevach, a korban. And what is that? V'haya b'yom zevach Hashem, on that day, ufakadeti al asarim ve'al bnei hamelech, everyone is going to be judged for their moral decay and for their idolatry and for worshiping the Baal and worshiping different idols and Malkat HaShamayim or Melechet HaShamayim, the kingdoms of the sky, all of that which was spoken about in great length. But the language of Zephania is cruel and vicious, of total and utter destruction. It's terrifying. So that is the day of the Lord, the Yom Hashem. Now, there is something very unique about Sefer Zephania, which I would like to get into. But first, he talks about Ba'et ha'i achapes et Yerushalayim banerot. This is a pasuk which we actually use to learn that we do b'dikat chametz with candles and not with avukot and not with torches. So when you are searching out in the crevices, crannies, and nooks for all of the crumbs, you use a ner, a candle. However, when we look at candles like this, which is a paraffin candle or wax, if you will, with a wick, that's not the actual candle that Zephania is talking about, because the nerot in the time of the first Bet HaMikdash is actually more like this. It is a clay lamp. It's a very simple one. This is a typical First Temple period clay lamp. Now, what I want to tell you is not only have I seen such lamps, I'm actually holding one in my hand in this picture. This First Temple period ner was found underneath my parents' house, my childhood home in the old city of Jerusalem, which is built, incidentally, right on top of Chizkiyahu's wall from 2,700 years ago. And when we dug there, we actually found a whole lot of things, and the things that we were allowed to keep by the antiquities authorities is this oil lamp, because they're not that rare, even though it's precious and it has educational value. If you look carefully inside the lamp, inside the ner, that is, it is filled with burnt wood, with charcoals. And those charcoals are remnants of furniture or of a house which was burnt during the Roman period of the destruction of Yerushalayim. That was all found underneath my childhood house. And if you ever wondered how I was drawn into doing all of this, talking about history, Tanach, archaeology, this is it. I practically grew up in a world in which it is one and the same. Our current, present, past, and hopefully looking towards the future with these lessons, this is really the natural setting in which I was born. So this is Echapes et Yerushalayim banerot. I will search Yerushalayim with candles in order to find all those people who need to be punished. So it is actually used in the context of searching out everybody who is deserving of retribution and punishment. It's not such a pretty scene, but we love using that pasuk. Now, what is unique about Sefer Zephania? As I mentioned, Huldah talks about the destruction of Yerushalayim by Bavel. Yirmiyahu does. And even Yeshayahu and Yechezkel talk about the destruction of other nations around us, for example. But it's Zephania who talks about both together. So Zephania talks about the destruction of Yerushalayim, but he also talks about Ammon and Moab, and he also talks about the Philistines. And this is very important, and I'd like to dedicate a few moments to speak about each one of these. So we know from the story of Yirmiyahu and other descriptions of the Churban that Ammon and Moab were involved in the coup against Bavel to try to throw Bavel off and to maybe ally with Egypt or whatever it is. But basically, they are implicated as involved in this general regional rebellion against the nascent Babylon. So when Nebuchadnezzar comes to conquer the area, he dishes retribution out to everyone, and that includes Ammon and Moab. Let's speak first about Yerushalayim. When we speak about Yerushalayim, we have to understand that he's speaking to people who are living in Yerushalayim and have a mental image of what the city looks like when he is saying the things he says. So here is a map of First Temple period Yerushalayim on the right-hand map, which is a map from Da'at Mikra. And he says as follows, והיה ביום ההוא נאום השם קול צעקה משער הדגים ויללה מן המשנה ושבר גדול מהגבעות הלילו יושבי המכתש כי נדמה כל עם כנען נכרתו כל נטילי כסף. On that day, there is going to be shouting and screaming from the fish gate. And then there's going to be wailing from the double wall or the Mishneh. And there's going to be shattering and the sound of things breaking from the hilltops, from the Gvaot. And those people in the Machtesh, in the valley, are going to be crying out. What are all of these locations? These locations are part of the simple map of Yerushalayim at the time. So I've put them more or less on the modern map of Jerusalem on the left so you can get an idea of it. So Shar Hadagim or Shar Ephraim, Shar Binyamin, these are all places which people know as the streets of Yerushalayim, and we're actually going to be revisiting a lot of this, Be'ezrat Hashem, when we get to Nehemiah and we talk about the rebuilding of Chomot Yerushalayim. These locations are going to be very important, so we're going to be revisiting them, Be'ezrat Hashem, in much more detail when we talk about Sefer Nehemiah. But just to drive the point home, imagine the Navi, instead of talking about Shar Hadagim and the Mishneh and the Machtesh and the Givaot, is actually talking about Fifth Avenue is going to stop glittering. And you realize, oh, it's a play on word because Fifth Avenue in New York City is the Diamond District. Or, for example, he says, Lawrence, Five Towns, Teaneck, Deal, those places are going to be run over by wolves. Wall Street is going to be full of wolves and wild animals, like in the movie I Am Legend with Will Smith, right? So that is something which really terrifies and makes an impact on people who are living there. And I'm going to talk about what we're experiencing today a little bit towards the end, because I think there are some very important points to think about. But the point is that when you mention names of places, it's not just, oh, can I find them on the map? It's like, what is the impact that it has on people at the time? Hagvaot is the Gvaot around Yerushalayim, because we know that Yerushalayim harim savivla. Yerushalayim is a mound covered with mounds, and you're saying all the mounds are going to be wailing and crying. And you're talking about the Machtesh, which in modern Hebrew is crater, but it simply means an area which is lower down, so it's like a valley, okay? So you have people in the valley, which is the valleys around Yerushalayim, like the Kidron Valley, the Ophel, or the Tiropion, as it's called in the Second Temple period. But we're basically talking about the slopes to the east and the west of Yerushalayim. It's describing our setting. So this image, which I put for fun in the background, I think really drives the point home, because you're saying like, oh, that's the Statue of Liberty. It's destroyed, of course, by aliens. And these aliens are as illegal as it gets. Now, that's the destruction of Yerushalayim. Let's talk about the destruction of the other nations, which are mentioned together alongside with Malchut Yehuda. Zephania talks about the destruction of the Philistine coast, of the Philistines, and he does it with a play on words, which is why I'm going to read it out. He says, Ki Aza azuva tihyeh, ve'ashkelon lishmama, Ashdod batzahorayim yigarshua, ve'ekron te'aker. He's playing on the words Azah and Azuvah. It will be abandoned and bereft. Ekron will be uprooted, Te'aker. These are 4 of the 5 Philistine cities. Which one is missing? Let's see if you got this. Oops, you got. That's the one. Gat, Tel Safi. I'm going to link an article in the description about Tel Safit, about Gat, Biblical Gath, because it's a very important city. Why is Gat not mentioned here? Because Gat Pelishtim was destroyed by Chazael, a story which is mentioned in Melachim Bet, but we also have some historic documents that talk about that. And speaking of historic documents, this campaign of Nebuchadnezzar, who came and destroyed all of these Philistine cities, which, by the way, it says, Ho yoshevei chevel hayam goy kretim, you are the nation who sit on the coast, but you come from Crete. Devar Hashem alechem Knaan Eretz Pelishtim v'ha'avadetich me'en yoshev. And he goes on and talks about Ashkelon, and then also he goes back to Ammon and Moab. They will be destroyed like Sodom v'Amorah. But the point is that the Philistines we are talking about here are invaders from the Aegean Sea. They come from Crete. That's how they're being identified. Now, we have more historic documents. Many of them are like these in the British Museum, which are called the Babylonian Chronicles. The Babylonian Chronicles are very important to the story of the Churban, because the Babylonian Chronicles list the campaigns and conquests of Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel in the region. And it details the destruction of these cities, which we mentioned. There's Ashdod, Ekron, Gat, Azah, several of them. So we get a broader picture of the destruction, which, as far as we know until now, we just look at it from a very Jewish perspective. He comes and destroys Yehuda. And then there's the Nevi'im, which talk about the destruction of other cities as retribution for what they did to us. But here he brings the two together. He's the only Navi who brings the two together, combined, in sync with each other, because it's part of the campaign of Nebuchadnezzar to come and to destroy Yehuda. And now we come to our final point, the end of Sefer Zephania. The end of Sefer Zephania talks about the upcoming destruction of Bavel itself as well, and the consequent rebuilding of the destroyed Malchut Yehuda. Now, the terms in which he speaks are also similar to the final Geula, but it seems clear that a big part of what he's talking about is actually the destruction of Bavel and the rebuilding of Beit Sheni. And I'm calling this the end of an era. The end of an era. Zephania talks about Yerushalayim as Ha'ir Hayonah, the city of the dove. It's one of the many names, one of the 70 names actually, of Yerushalayim. And he talks about all the destruction that's going to be followed. But he finally turns it around. And he says, Ki eten etchem leshem uletehila, you will be a name in the world. You will be praiseworthy. And that really connects us to what we are talking about. And that connects us to where we are today. Today we are at the end of an era. And I want to talk about what it means to be at the end of an era. But first, let's talk about the fall of Bavel. And this painting by my favorite painter, Rembrandt van Rijn, is a painting of Belshazzar's feast, in which the writing on the wall appears, Mene Mene Tekalu Parsin, which Daniel interprets, and it talks about the fall of Bavel by the Persians. And this is the ultimate judgment against Bavel, because Mane Mane Tekalu Parsin, you have been weighed and you will be taken over by the Persians. Now, this is the final king of Bavel. According to history, his name is Nabunaid or Nabonidus, and that is the subject of the Cyrus cylinder of the rebuilding of the temples of Bavel under the auspices of the Persian Empire. And these are temples which were shut down by Nabonidus. And Nabonidus is mentioned in the Al Yehuda documents. He's mentioned in the Elephantine Papyri. We've spoken about these in previous episodes, but I'm going to link to that as well, to a Chidon Tanach video that I did about the El Yehuda and the papyri from the island of Yeb, known as Elephantine. So that's going to be in the description. But the fall of Bavel and the rise of Persia is part of a transition between several different Malchuyot, which is going to be discussed at length, Be'ezrat Hashem, in Daniel. And I have a very special Torah about it, which I call the Four Kingdoms Torah. I recently did this live, and it's recorded, high quality edited. So if you want to hear more about the Four Kingdoms Torah, I'm linking to that in the description. You can reach out to me and actually rent the video for a little while and watch it. It's a great video about the four kingdoms, about this transition of the world powers from Bavel until Edom, and also talking about current events. Now, as mentioned, the rise of Persia is celebrated in the British Museum on the Cyrus cylinder, and this is the famous Cyrus cylinder. And the proclamation of Cyrus the Great, Koresh, in the Cyrus cylinder echoes or parallels the words which he says at the closing of Tanach, at the opening of Sefer Ezra. And this is a very appropriate place to have the cutoff between Sefer Zephania and the next or last three of Trei Assar. Because Trei Assar, which is 12 small prophets who prophesied over a period of about 300 years, are during the Assyrian period, during the Babylonian period, and during the Persian period. So Zephania is talking about the coming of Bavel, but also the fall of Bavel. But it's a great segue into the Persian period, because Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are already deep in the Persian period, which is really where we're going to pick up next episode, Be'ezrat Hashem. Here, I would like to wrap up with a brief thought about the end of an era. We are experiencing now, in modern times, in the year 2021, the end of an era, in the sense that the world that we know is ending. The security of Jews in the world and world opinion about Am Yisrael is, to say the least, on the spotlight. We're starting to feel like the world that we took for granted is no longer as solid as we thought it is. And it's really hard to see beyond the crisis. Or if you are an Asimov fan, if you've read Asimov's Foundation, the next Sheldon crisis. But this crisis, which Be'ezrat Hashem we're going to emerge from stronger, is all pointing towards the direction of where Yisrael is headed, which is a major part of the Nevi'im's ultimate mission is to awaken us to this period of time, to the real Yom Hashem. And I'm going to give you something small to think about. The first Rashi in Torah, the first Rashi on Bereshit, Perek Aleph, pasuk Aleph, is that the nations of the world are going to come together and accuse Israel of stealing the land that they're living in. For about 15,000 years, since this midrash which Rashi quotes has been around, who took this midrash literally? We may have taken it seriously, but not literally. This is one of several examples in which this midrash brings to life what we take for granted as a reality. What does it mean that the nations of the world speak? How does a nation speak? Ask anyone up until World War I, and you'd say, well, this is some sort of metaphor, it's an idea, maybe it's the malach, the metaphysical representation of that nation, like Saro shel Esav, we talk about struggling with Yaakov, right? It's something spiritual, it's something esoteric, it's something eschatological. It's not intended to actually be a nation speaking. And besides, why in the world would the nations of the world be preoccupied with this tiny little piece of land, and who has the moral right to be in it? Lo and behold, an organization called the Umot HaOlam, the nations of the world, the United Nations, coalesces, is formed, and 99% of everything they care about is accusing us of stealing this land, of being immoral. And this is world opinion. That's where we are at. So we are coming full circle from the beginning of Bereshit to a period of time which is, on the one hand, about a local story, which was the collapse of Yehuda and the collapse of Bavel eventually, but it is also speaking on universal terms. And that's the idea of the Nevi'im, which Chazal say that Nevi'im, which their Nevu'ah was nizkeka ledorot, was nitzrecha ledorot, was relevant for all the generations, was written down. So I implore you to look at the Nevi'im through that double lens. One, what is it saying locally about its period of time, but two, how does it impact us? Because it's very clear that we are living through the end of an era, and we are about to see some incredible things, and hopefully we'll all be able to see things turn out in a positive way. That's all I have for you for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. Don't forget to hit that like button, smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm so that you show the world that this is worth watching, and then YouTube will suggest this video to other Tanakh lovers like yourself. All right, thank you, and see you on the next one.